Hi, everyone. It's Dr. C with the video lecture for week 6. At this point, we've gone through the first essay cycle. You submitted your final draft of essay 1, that is essay 1.3. I'll be going through those and grading those as quickly as possible. The deadline for us to get those done is next weekend, not this weekend coming up, but the following weekend. So sometime between now and then, I'll have these all scored for you with comments and feedback that'll be meant to help you with um, meant to help you sort of unpack what you did with the assignment and also help you um, prepare for essay 2, right? The feedback and comments I give you in essay 1 would be meant to help you prepare for essay 2 and hopefully avoid any kinds of problems that you may have had in essay 1 when you draft essay 2. And I will quite likely in most of the comments be referring to something in your writing process that must be adjusted or needs to be adjusted or ought to be considered to be adjusted in order for you to improve from essay 1 to essay 2, right? Okay, so I thought what I would do in this lecture is kind of compress um, a couple of things. Number one, I want to talk about the readings that you had to do for last week, but I also want to talk about them in conjunction with I want to talk about them in conjunction with a recapitulation of the video that I did for week 4, which had some audio problems in the demonstration part of it, where I went through the whiteboard and sort of showed you, walked you through a map of kind of standard written argumentation, structured written argumentation, how it tends to work. So I'm going to go ahead and click over to my iPad in just a second and walk you through that map again. I think I've resolved these audio problems, but that's what I'm about to do. I want to explain why I'm about to do that. And in the process of explaining that, I'm going to go a little bit further and actually dive into an element of this kind of writing that speaks to the readings that you had to do for last week. We did not have a lecture last week, and those readings, you were meant to refer to those readings in the response that you had to do recently. But I wanted to go ahead and talk about those readings and really sort of tie them in to what you've just done, as well as to how you can use those readings to help improve the structure of your own written argumentation, if that makes sense. Okay, so let me go ahead and switch on over to my iPad, and I'll continue talking. Hold on. Okay, so here we go. So I'll start from the beginning, and I'll just kind of walk. I'm going to just basically go right through this demonstration in a very similar way as I did before in that video that had the audio problems. So bear with me. If you've gone through that video and happen to get through those audio problems, okay, and some of the stuff might be repetitive, but hearing it again is not a bad thing at all. So, okay. So the first thing with any, and this is a map for any argumentative essay. And I want to take a step back for a second and remind you that we did several things called, I might have referred to them as essays, synthesis essay, the analysis that you did. Those you can call them essays, but this is a sort of a map of a proper argumentative essay. An argumentative essay where you have a thesis statement and you're making a case, you have reasons for that thesis statement to be valid and true, and you're using sources to help support the argument that you're making. Standard argumentative essay, right? Got to have a title for them. It's not a title on the screen here, but you got to have a title for it. I will have, in this demonstration, you will see this mark here. Let's see. This mark here. It is a paragraphing mark. It looks like a P with another stem drawn through the bulge of the P. That's a paragraphing mark, and you see lots of them all over this whiteboard, right? Some of them you'll see, I will point out in just a second. Some of them are what I consider to be, it's a paragraphing mark means that you need to start a new paragraph, right? Some of these paragraphing marks or paragraph breaks are mandatory. They're hard paragraph breaks, is what I refer to them as, right? And the easiest way to explain this is to sort of point out that after your introduction and before the body of an essay, you know that you're supposed to start a new paragraph, right? That's a hard paragraph break I just circled. Between when you move on from one reason or point to the next in the body of the essay, you know that you're supposed to start a new paragraph, right? So there's a hard paragraph break here, and there's a hard paragraph break here. And there's a hard paragraph break here, because you also know from your experience writing essays in high school that you need to start a new paragraph when you move from the body of the essay into the conclusion. Here, I have a section on counter argumentation, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But the same idea applies. This hard paragraph break must exist before you move on to the counter argument section, or if you don't have a counter argument section and you move on to your conclusion, then you have to have a paragraph break between the body and the conclusion. So after the body must appear a hard paragraph break, regardless of whether you're moving on from the body to the counter argument section or from the body to the conclusion. And between the counter argument and the conclusion, there must also be a hard paragraph break. These are mandatory paragraph breaks. What a lot of you are struggling with, and I'll go back up to the top actually, because you have a context and definition section up here. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but that's another section of the essay that is optional, much like the counter argument section. It's something that sometimes students want or need to include, but it's not always necessary to include that. But after the intro and before the context definition section, you have yet another hard paragraph break. So anytime you move on from one quote unquote section of the essay to another quote unquote section of the essay, you should always start a new paragraph. And I say quote unquote section because I don't want you sectioning your work, giving it section titles or adding additional line space between the sections of the essay. I want you writing an essay from the beginning to the end, but it is useful when talking about the structure of essays to talk about the quote unquote sections of the essay. Just don't want to use that term and lead you to think that you should actually be sectioning your work. You should not. You should be writing fluidly from the beginning of the essay to the end using paragraph breaks, but no section breaks, right? Okay, so those are your hard paragraph breaks. But what's really giving y'all a lot of trouble is this concept, and I'm going to kind of try to circle this. It might look a little fuzzy. I'll try to use a red pen here. Is this concept of paragraphing within sections of the essay, quote unquote sections of the essay, where, let's see if I can, there it is. Okay, sectioning within sections of the essay, paragraphing within sections of the essay in a way that helps facilitate reader comprehension, but isn't mandatory by the need to include hard paragraph breaks. In other words, I call these soft paragraph breaks, and that's what's giving y'all a lot of trouble. And I'll walk you through that in just a second. But these hard paragraph breaks, I think that kind of paragraph instruction that a lot of you got in high school help prepare you for these hard paragraph breaks. But the downside of that type of instruction is that it gives you a false sense of paragraphing and really tends to inculcate within students the sense that paragraphing is more task-based than understanding-based. Sure, it's task-based, meaning that you have to, it's a task, in other words, you have to do this. Start a new paragraph when you move from the intro to the body, after the body, before the conclusion. But it's also, paragraphing is also it's much more nuanced than that. It's also about making sure that your reader really understands what it is you're trying to say and using paragraphs so that you can say things more clearly. The two things are connected. If you don't have a strong sense of those soft paragraph breaks or how you can paragraph things differently in the body of the essay, then this is something that you really want to pay attention to for the rest of the term. We'll be working in lots of different ways on paragraphing for the rest of the term, but that soft paragraph problem I've just laid out is the bugaboo for most of you in this class. One thing I want to point out, before I move on to sort of, well, actually, I'm going to start off, I'm going to go to the very beginning and I'll come back to this concept of paragraphing and you'll see why in just a second. Okay, so students are often like, well, how do I craft an essay? How do I structure an essay? How do I build an essay? I'm going to walk you through that. First thing to understand is the introduction of an essay. Here we are, the introduction up here, right? The introduction of an essay, that wasn't meant to be an asterisk. It's a very bad asterisk. I apologize for that. Basically people often have this kind of funnel approach they use for intros. I try to remind them that, you know, in high school, you learn a funnel intro where it gives you a sense that you're supposed to start with a wider topic and then narrow your topic. That's a problematic way of thinking about introductions. There is a funnel movement that happens in an introduction, but the funnel actually goes like this. You start off with identifying your topic, Then you funnel toward identifying your problem, which is something more specific about your topic. Then you funnel toward identifying your thesis statement, which is your stance on that problem. So you see that funnel isn't about narrowing your topic, it's about moving from topic to problem to thesis statement. Some of you will choose to use an enthymeme instead of a thesis statement. I want to point out that either way is fine by me. If you feel like you strongly understand how to build and construct your own enthymemes, then by all means use an enthymeme, but you're perfectly fine using a thesis statement in place of an enthymeme in this course. I'm going to remind you of that. So that funnel movement from topic to problem to thesis statement is really important in an introduction, and many of you struggle with that. You're still stuck in that zone where you're trying to go from a bigger topic to a narrow topic, and you might end with your thesis statement, but then at the end of your thesis statement, you do something like announce all the sources you're going to use in the body of the essay, or list your sources or list your reasons. That's kind of problematic, and we'll talk about that as we move through the term. What I want you doing is simply, if you find yourself doing that, just express your thesis statement. The body of the essay is where you're actually going to be developing your reasons and using those sources to support those reasons. So you wouldn't really need to bring up your sources in your introduction, simply to announce to your reader you're going to use these sources. Use the sources when you need to use them. You don't have to announce them in your thesis statement. If you're crafting an enthymeme, at the end of that enthymeme after the because is a summary of the reasons that you're going to be using to develop your thesis statement. It's not a listing of those reasons. I hope that makes sense. So after the introduction, which really should constitute, you see these lines going from the conclusion to the introduction, these lines here, it's a line of equivalency. It's illustrating for you that your introduction should be about the same amount of page space as your conclusion. Now, your introduction might be a couple of paragraphs long. Your conclusion might be a couple of paragraphs long, or your conclusion could be one paragraph and your introduction is 2 paragraphs long. It doesn't really matter how long they are in terms of paragraphs. What matters is the amount of page space that they occupy. Your reader is never counting the number of paragraphs that you have in an essay, but they are keeping track of the amount of time that you spend on a particular thing in your essay. If you spend a lot of time on your introduction, but not very much time on your conclusion, then that will result in an inequivalent or unequivalent amount of page space that you've dedicated to each one. This is one way of getting around that sort of soft paragraphing issue that I mentioned a little while ago. Once you realize that a lot of what you're doing in this kind of writing is managing page space rather than just paragraphing, then all of this starts to make a little bit more sense. And I'll return to this idea of page space a lot, but as you see, all these marks here, and I'll shade over some of them, so you see what I'm talking about. All these marks here are actually demarcations of page space. And I'll walk you through just how you can use that page space to both improve your essays and help you develop a better and stronger sense of paragraph. And when you move from the introduction to the body, you might, in between the introduction and the body, need to define a term or establish some context. I'll go back to the SUV argument that I was laying out in the enthymeme video for this. Remember, SUVs was the topic. SUVs are a great purchase was the thesis statement. SUVs are a great purchase because they are convenient. That was the enthymeme. And the reasons there were SUVs have a great towing package, SUVs are great off-road, and SUVs are very spacious, right? Those 3 reasons boiling down to them being convenient. SUVs are a great purchase because they're convenient. Again, was the enthymeme for that argument. And that particular argument, I could see very easily moving from an introduction that identified SUVs as a topic, the problem being that SUVs, even though they are everywhere, people often wonder whether SUVs are actually worth the extra cost. The average SUV is worth, et cetera, number of dollars more than other. They are worth more than other cars. They cost more than other types of vehicles, right? And the thesis statement or enthymeme there, would end that introduction, and there we have the argument that SUVs, we were led to that argument, that thesis statement or enthymeme, that SUVs are actually a great purchase. And the body of the essay would be spent illuminating the reasons why they are a great purchase, right? So if you set up that intro that way, then it's quite possible that in order for you to really sort of do the best job possible and the body of the essay is developing this argument that you've laid out, you may need to define what SUVs are. And here's a great place for you to do that. After the intro, but before the body, in a separate paragraph section of the essay, you would define what SUVs are. Establish the context for an argument if you need to establish that context. Anything that you can do to make the argument easier, whether it's defining a term or establishing a particular context, you can actually do after the introduction, but before the body. Students often neglect to do this, and in the body of the essay find themselves stuck because suddenly they have to define a term that if they had defined it early in the essay itself would have made the development of the body, or even just that section of the body, much more effective. I strongly urge you to just keep in mind that you can always define things early in your essays after the introduction, but before the body. This will prove very useful to you later on. Now notice that page space equivalency that's here and here. Counter argumentation, if it's present, and the context definition section, if that's present, those should be roughly speaking an equivalent amount of page space, roughly speaking the same amount of page space. After the context and definition section, or if it's not there, you're moving just from the intro, you move to the body of the essay, which again, you need to start a new paragraph before you need to move to the body of the essay. In the body of the essay, you will be developing your reasons or your reasoning why your thesis statement is valid and true. For those using thesis statements, a good way of doing this is to, at the beginning of, well, first of all, every time you move from one reason or the other or point to the other, you need to start a new paragraph. Those are the hard paragraph breaks. But in the development of each one of these reasons, you may spend a different number of paragraphs. You can see that there's 3 paragraphs for reason number 3, 2 for reason number 1, 2, and 2 for reason number 1. So 2 for reason number 2 and 2 for reason number 1. But each one of these reasons is being developed in, roughly speaking, the same amount of page space. That flexibility in paragraphing allows you the ability to paragraph things, to use paragraphing, to be clearer in your writing, which a number of you are still struggling with that concept of using paragraphs to sort of divide things up so that they're in bite-sized chunks for your reader, and so it's easier to understand what it is you're trying to argue. A bunch of you are still stuck in that zone where you're developing an idea and want a long paragraph rather than realizing somewhere in the middle of that paragraph, you're actually moving on from part 1 of the idea to part 2 of the idea, and maybe you should start a new paragraph to make things easier for your reader to understand and for you as a writer to deal with in paragraphs. So if you remember this concept of page space and noting that each one of these reasons has to be developed in roughly the same amount of page space, but that they can feature a different number of paragraphs per reason, then that'll, I think, make for a lot better crafting of the body of the essay. This is especially true for those of you who are using enthymemes, especially if at the beginning of each paragraph where you start developing your reasons. So the first paragraph for reason number 1, the first paragraph for reason number 2, and the first paragraph for reason number 3. If at the beginning of those paragraphs you use the exact reason that you developed when you were putting together your enthymeme, if you do that, then it makes for an even easier time building the body of the essay, because the repetitive nature of the sentences that you begin the development of each reason with, in other words, those reasons look very similar to one another, they will recall one another as the reader moves through the essay. So you don't have to say, my first reason is, my second reason is, my third reason is, because the reasons look similar to one another and they are all at the beginning of paragraphs. That will work as touchstones for the reader as they move through the body of the essay, and it will remind them of what it is you're doing in the body of the essay. If this doesn't make sense to you, please use my office hours. This is a bit of a complicated thing, but for those of you that are working with enthymemes, or those of you who have thesis statements and very strongly delineated, clearly articulated reasons, you can use this concept of placing your reasons at the beginning of the paragraph, the very first paragraph that you're dealing with. Like for reason number 1, the first paragraph in which you start talking about reason number 1. For reason number 2, the first paragraph in which you start talking about reason number 2. Same thing for reason number 3. If you have those reasons at the beginning of those paragraphs, then it will make for an easier time developing those reasons in the body of the essay. Again, you can spend different numbers of paragraphs. You don't want to make them too wildly different, but you do want to make sure, regardless of however many paragraphs you have, for each reason, that each reason is developed in roughly the same amount of page space. Okay? So when you're developing the reasons, what you're doing, if you have a thesis statement, what you're doing is trying to develop the reason in a way so that it's clear what the relationship is between the reason and your thesis statement. In other words, why is this reason a reason for your thesis statement being valid and true? That should be clear by the development of each, by the time you finish developing each one of these reasons. If you're using an enthymeme, your job is even simpler. your job in developing each one of these reasons is to make sure that the reader understands what the relationship is between your reason and your summary of reasons by the end of the development of each reason. So for the first one, let's say your first reason is SUVs are spacious. You don't have to worry about why them being spacious makes them a great purchase. You need to worry about why them being spacious makes them convenient, because we've already established the relationship between convenience and them being a good purchase, right? In the introduction, when we went from topic to problem to enthemy. Now, all you have to do here is make sure that your first reason points directly at your summary of reasons. In other words, you develop your first reason in light of your summary of reasons. My first reason is SUVs are spacious. Well, how does that make them convenient, right? That should be made clear by the development of your first reason. The second reason, SUVs are great off-road. Great. How does that make them convenient? Remember, convenience makes them a great purchase. So all you have to do is illustrate or prove or develop this reason in light of establishing how this reason makes them convenient. Third reason, SUVs have great towing packages. Great. How does that make them convenient? If you prove that, then that helps illustrate that movement from topic to problem to enthymeme here. It helps illustrate how SUVs, them being convenient, makes them a great purchase, right? So I hope that makes sense. You can do it either way using a thesis statement or an enthymeme, and that's how you would do it for either one. The key there, again, make sure that you're developing each one of these reasons in the same amount of page space. Use paragraphing, the concepts of paragraphing, to make sure that you are developing them as clearly as possible in coherent and cohesive paragraphs. Notice that the body right here is actually the majority of the paper. It will be the biggest part of the paper. It will be the most spacious part of the paper. Your introduction for, let's say if you have a 4-page essay, 4 to 6-page essay, your introduction should be no longer than about half a page, which means your conclusion should be no longer than about half a page, right? If you do that, then suddenly you have 3 pages left for you to work on the body of the essay. Make sure that your counter argument, and an essay of about 4 to 6 pages, counter argument should be no longer than about half a page, and your context definition should be no longer than about half a page. Now you have 2 pages left over for the body of the essay if you're writing a 4-page paper, or roughly 4 pages if you're writing a 6-page paper. So you can see that the body of the essay will constitute the majority of the actual page space in the paper. If you have 2 pages or 4 pages, well, then you can go through this section, the body, and think about how you would divide up the body of the essay in terms of the amount of page space you dedicate to each reason. If you have 3 reasons and you have 3 pages, like let's say you're writing a 5-page paper and you've, through the conclusion and the introduction and the context and definition section and the counter arguments section, you've arrived at a sense, okay, now those 4 things end up taking 2 pages total, since each one is about half a page, right? So now you have, let's say it's a 5-page essay you're working on, you're budgeting about 3 pages. That means you have about a page per reason, right, to develop the body of the essay. So you can see how if you start breaking things down this way, you can sort of plan out your essay in terms of the page space, which frees you up in terms of paragraphing. All you have to do then is make sure that those hard paragraph breaks exist and that they are where they need to be. And then there's a lot more flexibility afforded you to paragraph the body of the essay. I hope this makes sense. If it does not, please talk to me during office hours and I'll be happy to unpack this for you further. But that's my breakdown of how you would structure and paragraph the body of the essay. You then, again, start a new paragraph before moving on to counter argumentation. Counter argumentation is great, but it's not always necessary. Sometimes the way that you identify and express and develop your reasons illustrates to your reader that you've thought about your argument from multiple perspectives. So counter argumentation isn't necessary, but sometimes it really is. And it sort of depends on the argument you're advancing. If you're going to include counter argumentation, it should appear after the body and before the conclusion. And again, counter argumentation should be roughly speaking the same amount of page space as the context and definition section. And really those 2 sections should be they should be about the same page space, if not shorter than your introduction and your conclusion. Sometimes counter argumentation sections run a little bit longer, but that's a good ballpark, right? And for in counter argumentation, all you're doing there, some students fall into this bad habit of identifying an argument and making an argument, and then for a counter argumentation section, they just set up some very weak straw man type argument that they just kind of they kind of beat down in an effort to show the strength of their own argument. That is not what counter argumentation is for. Counter argumentation is actually meant for, um, it's meant to be an opportunity where you can demonstrate to your reader that you've thought about your argument from multiple perspectives. So a good example of counter argumentation would be to recognize that somebody out there disagrees with your perspective and your position, but even though their argument is valid, here's why my argument still continues to be the stronger one, and why it's the one that you should consider to be valid and true. That's a different thing than setting up an argument, just beating it down. So that's really what counter argumentation is for. Conclusions, well, conclusion is where you conclude the essay, you wrap things up. There are lots of different ways of concluding essays. Most of you are doing pretty good at your conclusions so far. If I see any problems with it, I might have a separate lecture on conclusions. But if you have individual issues with conclusions and want some refresher on it, please use my office hours. I'd be happy to walk y'all through it. There is a Purdue OWL webpage on conclusions and how to craft good ones and some strategies that you can use for crafting good conclusions. I often suggest that students review that too, just to make sure that they understand things as fully as possible. So that's it for the breakdown of the essay itself. But in the body of the essay, as you can see, this blue arrow here is pointing. I'm going to take you over to a blue arrow is pointing in just a second. In the body of the essay, there's some things that that y'all need to work on a little bit that really speaks to the readings that you had last week. And really what this boils down to is the ability to do synthesis. And I'm going to move over just a little bit so you can see this arrow is pointing to. There we are. Okay. So here you can see, I'm just going to try to map out the point I'm making here by focusing on the first reason, right? So let's say, here's the argument we're looking at. There's the body of the essay we're just looking at, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to focus on the first section of the body of the essay, just to map out what I'm talking about so you understand exactly what I mean. I'm going to focus just on that first section of the body of the essay. Okay? So, and that's a little bit difficult to read at the bottom of this whiteboard. I apologize for that. But what it says down there is synthesis, local synthesis, how, evidence, claim, and reason. That's what it says. I'm actually going to try to rewrite this so just make it a little clearer. Hang on one second. Synthesis. Local. Evidence. Okay, that's a little clearer. So one thing to remember, synthesis refers to, it's a little bit of a complicated word, but basically what it means is you've got two things and you're arriving at a third thing through those two things. So when you're synthesizing in this class so far, you've been looking at articles and you've been trying to use those articles to arrive at your own thesis statement. That's a larger form of synthesis. But there's also kind of local synthesis that happens in the body of an essay, in particular in the body of an essay. And I'm going to walk you through exactly how that happens. So your first reason, keep in mind that the main assertion or thesis statement of a piece of argumentation is just its main assertion. Thesis statement, main assertion, same thing. The easiest way of explaining what I'm getting ready to explain is that you have when you make statements, most statements are assertions, but there are statements that are more factual than there are statements that are arguable, right? In this class, anyways, we use fact on one side, assertion on the other side, and the key thing to understand is people think of fact and opinion as being the opposite of one another. That's not necessarily true. If you the easiest way of breaking this down for students is to remind them that a long, long time ago on this planet, the Earth was flat, not round. We argued the roundness of the Earth into existence. In other words, people had to make that case before people accepted it as fact. Assertions are all facts that we have today started off as assertions. They have to be argued into the existence as fact. So that's just the way that it works, and it's a little problematic to think of assertions as being opinions and then thinking of fact on the other side. That's just not really how it works. So the first thing to understand is your reasons, right, are going to be assertions. SUVs are spacious. SUVs are great towing packages. SUVs are great off-road. All of those things, all of those statements are the reasons that I have for my thesis statement being valid and true, my enthymeme being valid and true. Those are all assertions. They all need to be proven, right? If it's a statement of fact, it doesn't need to be proven because people have argued into its factual nature. It's already been proven. But if it's an assertion, you need to make a case for why the reader should accept this assertion to be valid and true. Your main assertion is your thesis statement, but you have secondary assertions, and those are called your reasons. And in the process of developing those secondary assertions, you're going to make even more assertions, tertiary or third level assertions, and those are often referred to as claims. So here what I've mapped out is that you can see that in the development of the first reason, which is itself an assertion, right? You are going to, sometimes you're going to directly provide evidence of that reason. Sometimes what you'll do is actually go straight into the expression of a claim, something that you say, another assertion that you make in support of the assertion, which is your reason. So you can think of essays as being almost like assertion trees, right? And at some stages you have to sort of decide whether you need to provide evidence or support for the assertions that you're making. And this actually maps out how to do that. So let's say you're developing your first reason. Maybe you move straight from that reason into evidence, factual evidence or research evidence illustrating why that reason, which is an assertion, should be considered valid and true. Or maybe you move from that first reason to a claim. And then that claim itself needs evidence for the reader to believe that claim to be valid and true. If you support that claim then supports that reason. So you can see the assertion tree that I'm talking about. Sometimes the evidence will come in the form of quotations. Other times it'll come in the form of a summary. Other times it'll come in the form of a paraphrase. Often it'll come in the form of a mixture of all three, right? So students are often confused as to where they should actually include evidence or use evidence in their writing. I always point out to them that, hey, here's an example of how to figure that out. Let's say you have your first reason, you're developing it, and you make a claim, but that claim is something, it's not a fact, but it's something that most readers would accept as being true, especially the readers you're imagining for the argument you're laying out. If that's the case, then you can move on. If not, if that claim is something that your reader would look at and say, says who, according to who, then you need to provide evidence for that claim, right? And once you provide the evidence for that claim, it can come in the form of quotation, summary, or paraphrase. Typically speaking, it's actually a mixture of all three, right? Once you provide evidence for that claim, you need to then move on to synthesize that claim. And I put the local in parentheses after synthesis because this is sort of the more local example or smaller example of synthesis, but it's really important. Synthesis on this level is after you make your claim and you support it using evidence. Synthesis on this local level is a sentence or two in which you express how this evidence supports the claim or reason that it's meant to support. So it's not just enough to just drop a quotation in or make reference to a source after you make a claim that you mean that evidence to support. You also need to go ahead and provide some sort of rationale in a sentence or two as how that evidence supports the claim or reason that you intended it to support. That has to happen before you move on to the next piece of evidence, or it should happen before you move on to the next piece of evidence or claim, and then evidence that you provide in support of that reason that you're developing. So if you imagine this happening, not just for the first reason, but for the second reason and the third reason, you can see how you ought to actually be bringing in sources to support your argument. The most important place for those sources to exist is in the support of claims that you make in the body of the essay that your reader would not be likely to take at face value. In other words, those claims where you deliver them and a reader would say, says who. Anytime that happens, it is your responsibility as a writer of this kind of work to provide support for those claims. I think at this stage, you're probably starting to notice or realize just how technical this type of writing can be. I'm hoping that you're also realizing just how much work you have done up to this point in your life to prepare yourselves for the technicalities of this kind of writing. In other words, there's nothing that I'm walking you through right now that you haven't in some way, shape, or form in this class and in previous classes been preparing yourself for. It's just a bit harder now. And I think the readings that you did last week on acknowledging claims, using evidence, and on making good arguments and making good claims, um, as well as acknowledgements and responses. I think all of those kind of work together to illustrate to you just how, especially in this particular dimension of things, you can use these moves, these kinds of rhetorical moves, to strengthen your work from the inside out, which is really when we as professors and instructors are looking at your work, this is the way that we're looking at your work. Students often think it's about the flashy prose and about the dynamite intros. No, we're looking at the bones of your work. And what I've walked you through are the bones of this kind of work, bones of this kind of argumentation. So this in particular gives students a lot of trouble. And I've not gone through all the essays, the 1.3s yet, but I've noticed in the ones I've gone through that this is the thing that most of you are struggling with the most. This movement from reason to claim to evidence to synthesis, realizing or reckoning with identifying the specific claims that need support in your work. Those are the kinds of things that it tends to give y'all a lot of trouble. And I think as you move through the second essay cycle, some of this will resolve itself because you have so much more control over the sources that you use in your essay, or that you use to help build your argument. But if you're not attentive to the fact that you need to support claims that need support, that your reader requires that you support them, and you need to provide that support in a way that you then synthesize afterward. If you're not thinking in those lines, then you may end up kind of not doing the best job on your second essay. So I hope that makes sense. A lot of what we're doing is meant to help kind of mitigate these problems in your writing process if they exist. But I think stopping for a second and really sort of, noting that it's possible that this is happening in your work, and here's the mechanics of it, here's how to fix it, here's how to map it out so that when you're going through and developing your own reasons, especially with essay 2, you can try to catch these problems and nip them in the bud. I think that would be the best idea. So that's it for today. I'm going to go ahead and turn off screen sharing with my little whiteboard here so you can see my face. Okay, I look a little crazy right now. It's because I've been going crazy doing this video. But yes, so that's it for today. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, but that's the lecture for this week. We do have that proposal coming up this weekend. I've gotten some questions from some of you about that assignment. It's I like to call it a kick in the butt assignment. Really what it does is it gets you started thinking about the topic and the approach that you want to use for your second essay. At the end of the second essay cycle, it's really sort of a get started assignment. If you are worried about picking a topic that you may change your mind about later, you can still change your mind about your topic and your argument and your approach after the proposal. It's the annotated bibliography is the hard cutoff. So if you want to change your mind about your topic and your argument and everything after the annotated bibliography, I will strongly recommend that you don't do that. But after the proposal, I mean, that's part of what proposals are for, is looking into a topic, looking into things and deciding whether you really want to work on that. It'd be great if you propose something that you continue working on for the rest of the term, but keep in mind that it's very likely that you'll change your topic or your approach to some degree, maybe even to a large degree after you put together the proposal. It's just an assignment. It's meant to get you started and get you going. Okay, that's it for now. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I will do my best to help you out. Office hours next week would be a good idea to use if you have big questions about where we are and upcoming assignments. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.